Gresham College presents The Collapse of the Postwar Settlement 1964 to 1979 by Professor Vernon Bogdanor.
Ladies and gentlemen, this lecture is part of a series on post-war British politics, and I shall be talking about the collapse of the post-war settlement, the prelude to the coming to power of Margaret Thatcher. And the next lecture will talk on Thatcherism, and the final lecture will talk about the 1990s, if you like, post-Thatcherism, and this lecture is pre-Thatcherism, tries to explain how it came about. Now, those who've been to the earlier lectures will remember that they dealt with the construction of a post-war settlement and the broad satisfaction with it on the part of both major political parties. And the Conservatives, who were in power in the 1950s, actually managed to increase their majority twice in 1955 and 1959 because of that broad satisfaction. Now, around about 1960, for reasons which aren't wholly clear, that satisfaction began to diminish amongst what you might call opinion formers. Previously, people had said, isn't British economic performance good? If you compare it with the interwar years when we had mass unemployment and deprivation, we're doing enormously well. We're creating an affluent society. People are enjoying consumer goods they could never previously dream of, cars, television sets, foreign holidays, more and more people owning their own home. We can really compliment ourselves on our progress. Around about 1960, people began to say, well, perhaps we are doing better than we were, but when measured against other countries, we're not really doing very well at all. That other countries have consistently outgrown Britain since the war. And in 1960, people could say that British industrial production has increased by 40% since the war. It's not too bad. But when they looked at France, it had doubled since the war. Germany and Italy, 2.5 times 2.5 since the war. Japan quadrupled. So we were doing quite well, perhaps, but not well compared with other countries. And people said, what are we going to do about it? And the first response was that the post-war settlement needed buttressing, it needed reform. And that was the view of most centrist politicians from the Labour and Conservative parties. There were two extreme responses from the left and the right, which said the post-war settlement was itself to blame for our problems and that Britain could only improve her performance by getting rid of it. The left said, we must move on. We haven't got enough state control. It's only if you have a society in which the commanding heights are owned by the state that we can hope to improve economically. Now, that view was never particularly popular. The right said it's a mistake to have a strong state. We built up too strong a state since the war, and we should look radically at the post-war commitment to the role of the state, and in particular the welfare state. And in that you see the origins of Thatcherism. Now, that wasn't these views weren't very strongly held in the 1950s and 60s. There was an undercurrent which supported it. And probably the main representative of the left in the 1950s was Honorin Bevan, then Tony Benn, and of the right, Enoch Powell. But they didn't make much headway at that time because the immediate response to Britain's economic problems were to reform the settlement so as to strengthen and maintain it. And the optimism of the post-war years was still there, that we can put things right. Later on in the 1970s, people began to think, well, perhaps we can't put it right. And the way to put it right can be summed up in two magic words of the 1960s, which almost all sensible-minded people supported. The first was planning, and the second was Europe. Now, planning then became a magic word, and people looked to the continent, particularly to France, where they said France's economic success compared with Britain had come about because of planning. And from the period of 1960 to 1962, there was a great reappraisal of British economic policy, particularly on the part of the Conservative Party, traditionally dedicated to the free market and the absence of state control. They said that we need a lot more planning. And in 1961, they set up a National Economic Development Council, sometimes called NEDI, which had representatives of government, management and the unions to plan the economy, to see what more could be done. Now, of course, if you're going to plan the economy, one important part of the economy is wages and incomes. And so in 1962, the Conservatives set up another body called the National Incomes Commission, which was known as NICI, and that would plan incomes and wages. And this involved, of course, getting cooperation from the trade unions. And the Conservatives said if the trade unions cooperated, they would be given a place in helping to decide economic policy in forums like NEDI. But a bit vague, and the unions didn't really trust a Conservative government. They didn't know really what to do. Incomes policy had worked between 1948 and 1950. It had worked in a voluntary way, but it was not so likely to work as time went on, because in the late 1940s, the Attlee government said, if you want to keep full employment on your welfare benefits, you must show wage restraint. And these were new things, full employment and so on. So the union said, well, that's a reasonable request to make. But by the 1960s, these things were taken for granted. So what was the point of self-discipline? In any case, the trade union said, we'll get a much better deal from the Labour Party with an incomes policy than we will from the Conservatives. So they were rather sceptical about this. Now, you may say, looking at it in retrospect, this is a very odd thing for a Conservative government to be doing, to be strengthening the state and to be having an incomes policy which is in effect the state deciding roughly what increase in wages is affordable and what groups will get increases in wages perhaps above the norm, what groups less than the norm, and so on. Is this a sensible thing for a Conservative government to be doing? And you may argue this is an aberration for Conservatives to get themselves enmeshed in that. And you could say the Conservatives lost the intellectual initiative, that they'd got to power as a free market party in 1951. They'd said the Labour government had got too much enmeshed in controls, and now they were implicitly confessing that perhaps the left was right, perhaps we did need more control. So you may say this smoothed the path for the Labour Party, which came to power in 1964 under Harold Wilson, also committed to planning and also committed to an incomes policy, though Wilson rather artfully called it the planned growth in wages to conciliate the unions. So that may have been important in helping the Labour Party. Now, the Conservatives said we need faster growth, and they said we've been far too modest in our ambitions. They said we need a growth rate of 4% in the economy to pay for all the desirable things we want in welfare, health, education, and all the rest of it. There was one very small problem with the 4% growth rate, that we hadn't achieved it since mid-Victorian times. And people, I think politicians were even less clear about how they were going to get a higher rate of growth than they were in how to control inflation. So that was a serious problem. Someone once said that economics was the science of getting things wrong with confidence. And I should say the concern with growth in the 1960s actually led to growth being lower than it had been in the 1950s, that the obsession of politicians with growth meant the rate was rather lower. Now, it's also been said about economics that if you have two economists in the room, you'll have two opinions, unless one of them is Lord Keynes, in which case you'll have three opinions, two of which are his. But Harold Wilson and the Labour Party said 4% was far too unambitious, and the Labour Party would have a much higher rate of growth than 4%. In fact, as I say, the rate of growth in the 1960s was lower than the 1950s, and economists, politicians did not know how to secure it, and I think it's fair to say they probably don't know how to get it either. And I think all that they can say, which isn't helpful for politicians, is that the policies that are likely to improve growth are very long-term. For example, one way to improve growth might have been at that time better management education, better technical education. But the effects of that wouldn't be seen in the lifetime of one government. They'd be seen over a long period. And another example, we're perhaps seeing the benefits today, would be if you could get a more flexible labour market through reform of the trade unions. And that was done by Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s, and it took time, I think, for its benefits to be seen. I think it's reasonable to say we can see them now, that the recession has not led to such a high level of unemployment because of a more flexible labour market, though it's also fair to say productivity has not increased as much as it might have done. But the benefits of a flexible labour market took some years to have their effect. So the ways, what we do know, all that we do know about economic growth is it's a long-term matter. But of course, politicians didn't want to hear that because they're considering the next few years of the election. So that is a serious problem. And the effects of the policies of planning, which included incomes policy, which was adopted by the Labour Party, Labour went even further than the Conservatives because they adopted a statutory incomes policy. The Conservatives' policy had been voluntary. In the late 60s, the Wilson government adopted a statutory policy. The effects were to give much greater power to the trade unions, whose cooperation was needed to make planning effective, and to introduce an inflationary bias into the economy, and to lead to questions about whether Britain was governable if it depended on the trade unions. How do you get trade union consent? And that all tended to discredit the post-war consensus and led to Thatcherism. Now, the second magic word after planning was Europe. And Europe was meant to complement planning by bringing what politicians call the cold shower of competition into British industry. Europe was an expanding market, a great challenge, and therefore, hopefully, if Britain entered Europe, export trade would expand. The difficulty was that the export costs were high in Britain, that industry at that time was riddled with restrictive practices. The rate of technical progress was low, and trade union demands, as we've seen, have been increasing. So it may be that open competition with the continent would actually damage British industry rather than encourage it. But politicians didn't take that view. And the president of the Board of Trade in 1961, when Britain made her first application to join Europe, said that we must look at the problems of our trading relations with Europe as an opportunity and a challenge. I think the great effect of going into a wider European market will be that the efficient firms prosper and the inefficient will go down. That surely is precisely what we must see in this country if our economy is really to expand and our growth is to be more rapid. But Europe, just like planning, involved clashes with vested interests that were, if you call it that, which were very important at the time. The first was with the Commonwealth relationship and our supplies of cheap food, which wasn't a vested interest from the Commonwealth countries, particularly from New Zealand, Australia and Canada, because the common market policy was based on a supranational tariff, a common tariff of the common market countries, together with the sustaining of the incomes of farmers by policies which meant high prices for food. And this obviously suited the continental economies, particularly that of France, which had a very large agricultural sector. It didn't suit our own economy, which had a very small agricultural sector, and which, as I say, relied on Commonwealth imports for cheap food. So our method of subsidizing agriculture was quite different from that of the continent. And agriculture was a very important influence in the Conservative Party at that time, as no doubt it still is. And there was still great belief in the Commonwealth and obviously in the great advantages of cheap food. And when we tried to enter the common market, as it was then, the European Union was then called, in 1961, we hoped to negotiate special arrangements for the Commonwealth, as the French had done for their colonial empire. But this all failed, and gradually in the negotiations we had to surrender our hopes for that, and we had to agree to a very brief transitional period without special terms for the Commonwealth countries. And the 6 members of the community it then was, so they were prepared to have special arrangements for the Commonwealth only during a transitional period which would end in 1970, and that one would have to give way on all the other questions, which we did, but rather late in the negotiations, too late from the point of view of getting in, because de Gaulle's position during this time was strengthening in France, and in 1963 he vetoed British entry. Now, all the same, this, you may say, is another aberration in the Conservative Party, and I think anyone who didn't know any British history would find it odd that it was a Conservative government that first tried to get us into Europe, with the opposition, incidentally, at the time, of the Labour Party on what you might call Eurosceptic grounds, and the Labour leader, Hugh Gateskill, who felt a strong feeling for the Commonwealth, as many people of his generation did, said that if we entered Europe, it would be the end of 1,000 years of history, and that a federal system might suit the countries of the continent. It certainly doesn't suit Britain. So the parties have switched sides in a sense over the past 50 years. But you'll think it rather odd it was the Conservatives who tried to get us in, because here's another aberration in Conservative policy, if you like, because after all, the Conservatives tend to be the nationalist, the patriotic party, if you like. Isn't it a bit odd of them wishing to join a supranational organisation on the continent, which certainly Anthony Eden had not wanted to join, and earlier Conservative governments had not wanted to join. We were not involved in the early negotiation of that. So here's another problem with Europe, the second leg of the new policy. Now, all these problems, I think, reached their culmination in the short-lived Heath government from 1970 to 1974. Heath succeeded at the third attempt, because Wilson had tried to get us in and de Gaulle had vetoed it, but after de Gaulle had left the presidency in 1969, French attitudes relaxed, and Edward Heath was able to get Britain in, but only on terms which meant a rocketing rise in the price of food, which fueled what was already a high level of inflation. And it was clear at the time that entry into Europe was not, shall we say, particularly popular. And it's worth saying we didn't have a referendum then. We had a referendum in 1975 when we were already in, and that resulted in a 2-to-1 majority for staying in. Sort of the forces of British Conservatism on a small c, if you like, were enlisted in terms of staying in. But in 1972-3, when we joined, it might have been different, who knows. But anyway, Edward Heath got us into Europe. But the other wing of modernisation, planning, got Heath into very serious trouble indeed, because in 1972 he too instituted a statutory incomes policy, and that led him into a clash with the miners in 1974. The miners were determined to breach the policy. Heath thought on political grounds, but the miners said, we have a special case, our work is difficult, we've fallen behind in the wages struggle, and we really ought to be allowed to catch up. So that was a very serious problem, and Heath seemed to be caught in a cul-de-sac from which there was no way out. And he called an election on the slogan of who governs. And he appealed to the country in language which would have had a lot of effect in the 1940s, but by the 1970s, I think, was greeted with a belly laugh. I mean, he said this. He said, think nationally. Think of the nation as a whole. Think of these proposals, that is his statutory incomes policy, as members of a society that can only beat rising prices if it acts together as one nation. Now, in the time of Attlee and the Churchill peacetime government, I think people would have responded to that language with a great deal of deference, sense of social obligation resulting from the war. By the 1970s, that sense of social obligation had worn out, and different groups, including the miners, said, if we can use the market to get more, why shouldn't we? Why should we think of one nation? Why shouldn't we think of our position as miners? Now, Heath was caught in the cul-de-sac, as I said. He called an election, on the principle of who governs. And at the beginning of the campaign, I know from experience, Labour MPs at the time had told me they were terribly frightened. They thought that an election fought on the question of government versus the unions would lead to a Tory landslide. But the result was very different, and the reason I've circulated the paper on the result is that I think the February 1974 election is the most important single election of the post-war period, marking a watershed between the triumph of the post-war settlement and its ending. Now, if you look at that table, you can see, firstly, that it led to a hung parliament, that Britain's first hung parliament since 1929. Of course, the next one was 2010. So the answer to Heath's question, who governs, was we don't know. Now, there's a further oddity that if you do a quick calculation of the results, it was unlike the 2010 hung parliament in that no two parties together could secure a majority, except for the Conservative and Labour parties in coalition, which was unlikely. But there was no way that a major party, together with a minor party, could get enough seats for a majority being 318 seats. So to get a majority, you need a major party and at least two minor parties, which is very unlikely to happen. A further oddity of the result was that the Labour Party were the largest party, short of a majority, but the largest party, although the Conservatives won more votes, so that the wrong side won. Now that's an oddity. Now, another oddity about the result was that the Liberals made a breakthrough in terms of votes. As you can see, they got nearly 20% of the vote, but they won only 14 seats out of 635. And on a proportional system, they would have won nearly 130 seats. So you won't be surprised to hear that the argument for proportional representation began to get off the ground after that election. Previously, the Liberals had done so badly that people said, well, of course they would argue for proportional representation, wouldn't they? But given that governments got nearly 50% of the vote in the 1950s and 60s, as near as makes little difference, people said this is a theoretical matter which we're not going to bother ourselves with. It's a perhaps rather cranky idea. But here you see no party got more than, as it were, 38% of the vote, which is just over a third of the vote. And the Liberals seemed very badly done by. After all, they got half the vote of the other two major parties, but hardly any seats. So that was one problem. You can see the Constitution came into politics. Now, further troubles. The Northern Irish parties, it's masked here. There are 12 seats with 3.1% of the vote. But the problem there was that a group called the United Ulster Unionist Coalition, on 51% of the Northern Irish vote, gained 11 of the 12 seats. And that coalition's purpose, it was run by the Unionists, the Protestants, was to destroy the power-sharing arrangement which Edward Heath had established in Northern Ireland. The power-sharing arrangement is very similar to what Northern Ireland has now in the Good Friday Agreement from 1998. And so that the election gave the Northern Ireland Unionist parties, so they said, a mandate to destroy it. And in the summer, perhaps emboldened by the miners, there was a strike of power workers in Northern Ireland which compelled, or at least persuaded, the Labour government to end the power-sharing experiment. It came back in 1998. So the so-called Sunningdale Agreement was destroyed, and some people said the Good Friday Agreement was Sunningdale for slow learners, because you need another 24 years and many more deaths before Ian Paisley, who'd been instrumental in destroying the 1974 agreement, accepted something very similar in 1998. But that was a tragedy for Northern Ireland. And then if you look at Scotland, the SNP won 7 seats and 22% of the Scottish vote. And Scottish nationalism, having been seen before then as another cranky exercise, totally out of date, came into the forefront of politics and persuaded the government to spend a lot of time on proposals for devolution, which were then defeated in a referendum in Scotland in 79, or not defeated, but accepted by a very small majority, and Westminster did not implement it. Now, you may be interested with all the talk on devolution. 22% of the Scottish vote in February. There was another election in October 1974 at which the SNP gained 30% of the Scottish vote. Now, we all know how well the SNP has done in the Scottish Parliament, but if you look at the general election of 2010, the SNP then got 20% of the Scottish vote, which is less than they got in February 1974, and a third less than they got in October 1974. So if you're just looking at parliamentary elections, the SNP has lost a third of its support in a period of 36 years between 1974 and 2010, perhaps worth bearing in mind. But you can see all that led to devolution, and you can see how. Now, the election is very paradoxical, really, because it would seem at first that the election gave tremendous support to the centrist forces in British life. After all, Heath had gone to the country saying who governed, and people said, well, this is polarising, we don't want that. And they said, perhaps the Labour Party representing the unions, that's too polarising as well. Liberals got a huge vote, huge centrist vote, rejection of extremes. But in practice, as it happens, the election of February 1974, why I think it's so important, it signalled the end of consensus on the future, the end of the consensus on the post-war settlement. And Heath asked the question, who governs? And although you may say the election doesn't give a clear answer, I think there's one clear answer, not you. Heath, after trying, perhaps mistakenly, to form a coalition with the Liberals, resigned, and a Labour minority government took office, which had another election in October 1974, which it gained a very small majority, overall majority of 3, and continued to govern until 1979 when Margaret Thatcher came to power. But the question wasn't only how Britain was to be governed, who governs, but can Britain be governed at all against the veto of the trade unions? Because it seems if Heath had challenged the trade unions and actually been defeated by the trade unions, and this raised a very difficult problem, could Britain be governed against the wishes of the trade unions? That's one question. There was a second question raised by the success of the SNP and also, in a different way, by the success of the Unionists in Northern Ireland. And that question is still with us, I think. Can Britain be held together at all? You know, what is the country which is being governed? And that was a tremendous worry for politicians from that period. Now, the Labour response to how Britain could be governed was that Heath had fallen because his attitude towards the trade unions was confrontational, and that he wasn't offering the unions anything in return for wage restraint. And if he'd followed the principles of the Attlee government in the 1940s, they said, Attlee helped to create a fair society, and that's how you got union cooperation. And the Labour Party produced the idea of the social contract. They said in return for increasing what they called the social wage, that is benefits, unions should accept reductions or constraint on their real wages, as it were. And they said that is their policy. And this involved the Labour government of the day in serious problems. The first was that Labour took the view, perhaps naturally but foolishly, that they'd actually won the election, though their vote in 1974 was 1/8 less than it was in 1970 when they'd lost the election. The only reason they won was that the Conservatives lost even more votes, most of which went to the Liberals, some to the Scottish Nationalists. And the Labour Party took the view, this shows people do not want a policy against the wishes of the unions, that what people want is cooperation with the trade unions. And that was a misreading of public opinion, because every opinion poll showed that people thought not that the trade unions should have a greater role in policy making, but that they should have a smaller role in policy making. Indeed, many people were beginning to get rather frightened of the extent of trade union power. But the Labour government instead of reducing the power of the trade unions, actually increased it by making the closed shop mandatory and giving the trade unions all sorts of other powers in policy making. And they said, in return for this, will the trade unions exercise restraint? Now, this was a grave error, and odd for the Labour government to make, because the trade unions could not, even if they'd wished to do so, and many didn't, they could not reciprocate. For this reason, those with long memories who attended my lecture on the general strike, which must have been well over a year ago, will remember the problems the TUC had in coordinating action on the general strike. And the reason for that was that every union is autonomous and highly jealous of its autonomy. The TUC is a loose federation without power of the individual unions, which greatly resent any attempt by the TUC to control them. They are not willing to do that. The trade unions themselves do not have power over their members except by consent. And during the 1970s, trade union power was becoming fragmented with growth in power on the shop floor of shop stewards and the collapse of deference. And the shop stewards were saying, many of them on the left, if your union leaders are agreeing to wage restraint, you should go against their wishes because we can get you more money by a more militant policy. That had seemed to pay off under Heath because the miners seemed to have won their battle against Heath. So if trade union leaders cooperated, they had the risk of being undermined by people on the shop floor. And the situation was well summed up by a rather right-wing trade union leader of the miners, Joe Gormley, who said that these incomes policies, and I quote, put us in a false position. Our role in society is to look after our members, not run the country. What's more, I think the TUC overstepped its powers in trying to interfere with the authority of the individual unions. In point of fact, the TUC doesn't have any powers. It's a federation, and all its members are autonomous. Now, it may be that the policy proposed of the social contract could have worked in the 1940s when a sense of deference and civic obligation was very strong. Authority was much more secure than it came to be in the 70s when, I mean, the phrase is often used of the permissive society, which is an exaggeration, but the growth of individualism is an important feature of post-war politics, I think. A decline of a sense of civic cohesion, if you like, perhaps inevitable long after the war, a decline of the sense of social obligation. And the Labour Party wanted to create 1945, which I think couldn't be done. And the attempts to get the consent of the unions ended horribly in the so-called winter of discontent of 1978-9, with massive public sector strikes against incomes policy. And people like myself who remember that period will remember the folk images of rubbish left in the streets in London uncollected, cancer patients being sent home because the hospital porters were on strike, the dead being unburied in Liverpool having to be buried at sea because of the strike of those doing that essential public work. And this is, as it were, a horrible reaction against this, in a sense, rather noble vision that people who've attended earlier lectures may remember that Ernest Bevin, who I think is one of the most influential figures of the early post-war period, that Ernest Bevin had held. You may remember, if you attended earlier lectures, after the general strike, Bevin had said, strikes are not a sensible way of advancing trade union interests. Let's try and be more constructive. Let's work with management, let's work with government. We can't, of course, get a socialist society overnight. I don't expect that. But what we can do is to cooperate, work together to improve conditions. And the only principle I lay down is that the trade union should be consulted on policies that affect them. That people in the union shouldn't be treated as mere factors of production, mere hands. They should be consulted, their views should be taken into account. And that marked immediate post-war policy of both Labour and Conservative governments. It worked well, but it ended in this horrible caricature. And I think one can't exaggerate the effects of the winter of discontent. One of the Prime Minister James Callaghan, one of his advisors, Bernard Donahue, said after the general election of 1979, "There is no question that the public sector unions elected Margaret Thatcher in 1979. Indeed, she subsequently said thank you to them in her own individual way." And that been put forward in a very prescient comment by Aneurin Bevan after the Labour's election defeat in 1959. He said, "The trade unionist votes at the polls against the consequences of his own anarchy," which I think is a very powerful point, that people who pressed harder for wages when it came to the election, they were shocked by what happened, they voted Conservative. Now, I think the winter of discontent really frightened and horrified people, sort of breakdown of consent, and it frightened even people in the Labour Party. There's a very interesting passage in a book by a Treasury Minister at the time called Joel Barnett. He's called Inside the Treasury. And when there were strikes at the time, one of the strikes was of the porters and others working at the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital, of which James Callan, who was Prime Minister, his wife was the governor. And Tony Benn in the Cabinet apparently said, "These strikes are what happens if you press working people too far." And Callan replied, "What do you think of people who go on strike in a children's hospital? That's nothing to do with socialism as I was brought up to believe." And the Labour Party people were deeply shocked that these anti-social actions could occur by people within the Labour movement. And the country even more deeply shocked, and I think it didn't affect just the election of 1979, but elections right through to 1992. Indeed, I have memories of 1992 and people saying, and I was working for a television company then, that they did not vote Labour because it would mean another winter of discontent. The trade unions would control the country. It was a deep folk memory, as important as the memory of the Jarrow marches and unemployment in the interwar years. And if you had to choose one factor to explain why the Conservatives were in power for 18 years, why Margaret Thatcher was there for so long, I think that is a key factor. This great fear that people had, that if you voted Labour, you'd have the same all over again. And there was a cartoon in the Daily Telegraph in 1979 with a picture of Callaghan and a trade union leader behind him, and underneath it said, "Vote Labour or else." And that was, people were very, very frightened in a way perhaps difficult to understand now. Now, what happened to this great Liberal vote? Because after all, in the election of February 1974, 6 million people, 19% voted Liberal, by far the largest Liberal vote since the war at that time. In the October election, which followed a few months later, 5 million people voted Liberal, nearly as many, but people studying elections have found how volatile the Liberal vote was, that 3 million of those who voted Liberal in February did not vote Liberal in October, and 2 million who did not vote Liberal in February voted Liberal in October. So the Liberal vote is much more volatile than others, and the figures constitute great changes. But that indicated a decline in support for the two major parties, which was to continue and be strengthened as time went on, which of course makes a hung parliament more likely. But it wasn't noticed because for most of the time we did have single-party majority governments. And the Liberals thought to capitalise on this, and later on in the 1980s they had the support of a defection from the Labour Party called the Social Democrat Party, the SDP, but its policies wanted to recreate, as it were, the past. They wanted to recreate that consensus which had been shattered. And one supporter of the SDP rather unkindly caricatured it. He said what the SDP and the Liberal SDP alliance was offering was a better yesterday, and I'd go back to the past. And the Liberal vote in some ways shows an alienation from the two major parties, but it was not, if you like, a centrist alienation, and I think that was perhaps a mistake that Liberals made. It wasn't that people were worried about the Constitution and said we must have proportional representation and all these other Liberal nostrums. It wasn't that at all, but the alienation was, I think, from the post-war settlement, and the Liberals were the convenient vehicle for that. Now, when you had these incomes policies and planning, which people sometimes labelled corporatism, that involved management, the unions and government getting together to try and plan the economy. But what about those people who didn't belong to management or the unions? What role did they have in this dispensation? Weren't they the forgotten people? Now, a lot of these people formed the core of the Conservative constituency, with a large C, the constituency of the Conservative Party. Self-employed people, people in small businesses, people on fixed incomes, pensioners, people who would suffer enormously both from inflation and from trade union power. They weren't part of what seemed a corporatist consensus. Now, all the figures we have show that Conservative support is much stronger amongst such people than it is amongst the large managers in industry or amongst professional groupings. Indeed, that 90% of small businessmen and of the self-employed will vote Conservative. A much higher class consciousness, if you like, than amongst trade unions, where the trade union Labour votes about two-thirds of the organised working class normally have voted Labour. But this is 90%, a very, very strong degree, if you want to call it that, of class consciousness. These were the forgotten people. They always voted Conservative, but the Conservative Party didn't seem to be protecting them. It seemed to have forgotten them in its eagerness to get on terms with large businesses and with the trade unions. They were seemingly lost sight of. And these people were very fearful of the power of the trade unions and the policies needed to secure that power. The Conservatives were not protecting them, and therefore they would look to a new form of conservatism which would protect them. And that new form of conservatism could be called, if you like, Thatcherism. And Thatcherism, I think, is a response to that weakening of social solidarity and the weakening of the post-war settlement, which depended on social solidarity. And from that point of view, we often think of 1968 as a revolutionary year, and people like Tariq Ali and Tony Benn as revolutionaries, but perhaps the real revolutionaries were people like Enoch Powell and Margaret Thatcher, who were attacking the post-war settlement from the right. Because what we've seen was that these desperate attempts to recreate the settlement in the 1970s failed, and that the Conservative attempt to increase the power of the state might have been acceptable if it had solved the problem of inflation, if it had dealt with trade union power, but when it didn't, people said not only was it wrong, it was ideologically misguided. This isn't the sort of thing Conservative governments should be doing. Now, the essence of Thatcherism, or the alternative policies offered in the late 1970s, were that if you're going to resolve Britain's problems, you have to go beyond the post-war settlement. And instead of governments trying to operate with the unions and management, they must keep them both at a distance, give much greater role for market power. If that increases unemployment temporarily, that's a price that has to be paid for the necessary shakeout that's needed in industry. But you cannot have government planning of industry. Governments don't know very much about what makes a successful business. Pointless having incomes policies, they're counterproductive, and in any case, I think even a Labour government, if it had been returned in 1979, would not have had an incomes policy after the cul-de-sac which it had led people into. And that the Conservative Party should also be a much more nationalist party than it's been in the past. That, again, an aberration, a mistake for the Conservatives to go overboard about Europe. That doesn't fit in with the basic instincts of those people who vote Conservative, who tend to be perhaps rather suspicious of the continent, suspicious of foreigners, and want a more patriotic sort of policy. And so the ending of the post-war settlement led not, as you might think from the February 1974 general election, to a resounding movement of the centre or a consensus politics, but to the end of it. and the introduction of something called Thatcherism. And New Labour in the 1990s, you may say, was an adaptation of the Labour Party to Thatcherism, just as the Conservatives in the 1950s had accepted the Attlee government's policies and administered them. So New Labour accepted much of Thatcherism and agreed to administer that. But what I want to hope to have shown in this talk is that Thatcherism was not simply the product of one woman's brain, remarkable though no doubt that is, but that it can be explained as a result of the events that happened in the 1960s and particularly the 1970s, which led to the end of the post-war settlement. Now, you may think it's a good thing that the post-war settlement ended, or a bad thing, but I hope I've convinced you that it has in fact ended. Thank you.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.